WLS
Hosted by IDM.
And we are live. Hello, everybody. Hello, Nina. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Marcelo? Getting enough sleep in your new status? No.
Nope.
So you're in the same boat as the rest of us.
Yeah, I'm 2-3 weeks away to look just like Zelensky.
Hopefully you're sufficiently caffeinated. If you're going to look like Zelensky, you have to wear the military fatigues.
Yeah, I should.
The look is going to be incomplete. Actually, this would have been quite relevant for today's episode, because on today's episode of the Winter Latina Show, we're going to talk about the Russian army in detail. So this is sort of our first military analysis. We're very excited about our guest, who hails from Belgrade, Serbia. His name is Andrej Ćirić. I probably butchered that with my occasional Russian accent. He is an anthropologist, educator, and he's also a military affairs observer. I've been following his analysis of the war in Ukraine essentially since it started. Sometimes it's posted in Serbian, so I have to sort of half understand it with my Russian brain and half understand it with a translator. So it's a little bit complicated. Sometimes it is in English, but I've always found it useful because he provides, in my opinion, a very objective overview where he's not siding with the doomers, as I would call them, and he's not siding with the hooray patriots either. So the reason we want to look at the Russian army in a little bit more detail is the fact that since the escalation of the war in Ukraine, obviously the propaganda war escalated as well. So what we typically see in the Western media, and it specifically impacts people who either only speak English or people who are sort of in NATO land, let's call it that, and don't have access to alternative sources of information. And so the actual status of the Russian army is really kind of veiled behind this wall of propaganda. So what we see a lot is information that's being uncritically shared by mainstream sources directly from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. Sometimes the fact that it's coming from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is hidden somewhere lower down in the article. You have to dig it out. Sometimes it is mentioned in the headlines, but most of the time, in my opinion, it is shared uncritically. So as a result, we have this bizarre dichotomy. On the one hand, we've kept hearing, especially early on, that the Russian army was collapsing. On the other hand, we still keep hearing that the Russian army is about to take over all of Europe. So those things kind of don't match. And actually, that specific military analysis, I'm using scare quotes, is in line with the rest of Russia analysis. On the one hand, Russia is collapsing. On the other hand, Russia is this massive superpower. So the truth probably is somewhere in between. And I want to give you a couple of examples of Western media coverage that reflects that. So for instance, right now I'm looking at a Business Insider article from November 2022. Quote, drafted Russians were deployed to Ukraine without weapons and expected to dig trenches with their bare hands, end quote. Now,
were they not supposed to at least have shovels to fight the Ukrainians?
Well, that's my second example. This is the BBC from March 2023. Quote, Russian reservists fighting with shovels. End quote. This is coming from the UK Defense Ministry, which is also a pretty sketchy source, in my opinion. Let's put it this way. It's obviously a very interested party. This whole shovel meme, the sapper shovel meme, definitely took off in the media circles, mainstream media, and social media. Now, on the other hand, I'm looking at an article from the National Interest from last week, and it says that Russia's old T-72 is, quote, the best tank on earth, and Ukraine knows this, end quote. So again, we have this massive dichotomy between the Russian army collapsing, Russia having no equipment, and at the same time, Russia either planning to invade Europe or having the best equipment in the world, surpassing Western equivalents. So this is why we want to bring on Andrej to give us a lot more information for those of us who are not, who read this stuff, but we're not well versed in army military analysis. So Marcelo, let's bring him on, please.
Without further ado, welcome, Mr. Andrej.
Good to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. Very excited to hear your point of view. Like I said, I've been following your analysis, sometimes Google translated, which may be a little bit sketchy, sometimes in English for, since the beginning of the escalation, probably earlier, probably since the war in Donbass. And what I forgot to mention is that, well, you describe yourself as a reluctant micro-celebrity, but I would also describe you, like as I mentioned to you earlier, as a secret influencer, because some of the memes that take off on my X/Twitter were shamelessly stolen by me from Andrej's social media account. And so I probably have him to thank for some of this virality of my content when it comes to memes. So that's his other...
Sharing is caring.
Sharing is caring. There we go. Because we're from the old Soviet bloc. Of course, we're supposed to share. Come on, guys. So the way we want to structure this is, obviously, it's very difficult to cover everything about the Russian army. But I think initially we do want to talk about the history. We could strategically summarize it to the best of your ability. I'm interested in continuities and breaks in terms of development, equipment, strategy, tactics, etc., between the old Soviet army and the Russian army. And of course, the Russian army post, Soviet dissolution could probably also be looked at in terms of different periods, maybe the Chechen War, the Syrian War, and the modern Ukraine War. But this is me being a layperson, so obviously you know much more about this than I do, so you're welcome to structure this as you wish. But history is very important.
It is. It is because without understanding the development process last 30 or so years, it's impossible to understand what is happening right now. And there is a huge amount of crap being produced in Western media about it. And I mean, all those strategies are not actually new. When you go back all the way to 1940s, the Winter War with Finland, you had the exactly same nonsense being spewed. And Winter War is actually very interesting because it nearly caused France and Britain to actually join the Finnish on this particular item, although they were already in war with Nazi Germany. So it's completely bizarre event. And there has been this continuous reappraisal of the Winter War, in which, if you don't know actual history about it, you would come to think of it that Finns actually won the war. I mean, this is the popular cultural interpretation. I mean, Finns lost the war. They lost all the territory that was in question, and additionally more, as a sort of a taxation of sorts. And they lost considerable number of men and equipment. And only the goodwill of Stalin actually prevented them from still not losing even more or entire national sovereignty in total. So it's been complete loss. Then again, they continued on in a continuation war and got beaten all over again in 1944, which enforced this Finlandization, which has been, again, in a Western paradigm, interpreted traditionally as a sort of a negative spin, but it was actually quite positive for development of Finland. And it's a complete like a rewriting of history. Like all those games, movies, documentaries, they all only put spin on the Finnish successes, completely ignoring these Finnish failures and the way how the war actually ended. And yes, Red Army did have several times over number of casualties than Finland did in those days, but compared to number of per capita, number of population the both countries had, it's very, very inferior. It was much more costly for Finland, this war, than for Soviet Union. So, this is this complete reinterpretation, creative reinterpretation of history for geopolitical needs. And I remember that the same kind of a paradigm was being enforced to Georgia in 2000s. They tried to recreate Finland in Georgia, which obviously failed. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I just wanted to say that all this is a paradigm for what is happening right now. The same media strategies, the same strategies of interpretation of narratives, and probably the same post-war interpretations of war in Ukraine. They will probably, again, I mean, even now, there is some things, as enough time progressed, that books are actually being written right now, last year and this year, and they are taking for granted complete nonsense interpretation of events from 2022. The Battle of Gostomel Airport, for example, has been codified in this public interpretation as a sort of a Russian defeat, when it was in fact complete victory. I mean, those paratroopers achieved their aim in total. They captured the airport, they held the airport until the reinforcements came, and it was clear-cut success. But it was completely ignored in the narratives, and this is slowly coming into the history books. And I'm sure that in a Western interpretation of the war in the next decades, it will be still codified as a failure. So there's that. Anyway, development of Russian army. Red Army, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was in complete chaos. It started even before the collapse due to the transfer of troops from Eastern Germany and Hungary to various parts of the Soviet Union, which were unprepared to accept all those troops. There was no housing space, no depots to receive all this equipment, so it was complete chaos. And it carried over until 1993, even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, for a number of years. And of course, there was this question of ethnic and national identity of the officers, to which camp they will end up. So there's an interesting number of questions that number of Russian officers ended up serving in Ukrainian army, like General Sersky, while number of ethnic Ukrainians ended up serving in Russian army. And there are even cases that brothers, natural-born brothers, continued serving in two different armies up until 2022, which is pretty bizarre. I mean, it is a kind of a civil war in this sense. The problem was, of course, the total societal collapse in Russia and in most of the ex-Soviet Union during the 1990s. And the first Chechen war was also pretty traumatic event in Russia. I mean, as you obviously know. And this sort of illustrated this chaos which was inside the transformed Red Army, now the Russian army. Red Army was, of course, the huge, several million strong force, which was constructed to wage high-intensity war in Europe, potentially overslipping into nuclear war. And it had several tiers of the development of its armed forces, but it had this huge, very intensive core for these first few months of this high-intensity warfare, backed up by millions and millions of reservists, which were supposed to fill in a successive waves if the war continues as conventional warfare. Now, all this structure completely fell apart in the 1990s. And in Chechnya, for example, there has been problems where nominal regiments actually boiled down to small battalions, which were actually deployable. So there were various units from various sides of Russia being scrambled to mount this operation. And obviously, there was lack of cohesion, lack of unified command. It was just a mess. Now, this sort of it was worked upon during the 1990s. So the second Chechen war was considerably better run, better planned, better organized, with more cohesion. But these structural deficiencies remain because it was impossible to resolve them without proper restructuring of entire armed forces. And this is something which was in development since the late 1990s, early 2000s. There was various proposals and strategic plans to seriously restructure, to move away from the old Soviet model of the regiments, divisions, armies, etc. This eventually culminated in Serdyukov's reforms in 2008, between 2008 and 2012. Although even with Ivanov in 2002, there had been some attempts to move in this direction, and this is essentially not without some precedent, because even as back as late 1980s, Red Army actually experimented with the brigade structure and corps or small field army structure as more maneuverable elements. So all of these things were not done as a pure imitation of the Western forces, Western force structures, as is often interpreted in the Western media, but is sort of an organic theoretical development, an organizational development which was already being experimented inside Russia and before that in Soviet Union. Essentially, what Serdyukov did was he recognized deficiencies in army structure, and that the nominal divisions were effectively regiment-based. But even those regiments were not, because typically division has 3 to 4 regiments, the manpower was spread thinly between those regiments. So essentially, he recognized this is a serious deficiency, that you cannot easily collect people from all those different regiments and create ad hoc units, but that it's better to just consolidate all those manpower and equipment into single brigade, which effectively replaced division-sized elements, and have a compact brigade which is immediately deployable and which has its internal cohesion. Now, Serdyukov is hugely unpopular inside Russia, especially among the military men, for several reasons. Now, he first of all went to clinch with the military authorities and the whole military elite of the Russian army, because again, this was started in the previous administration, under the previous Minister of Defense, attempt to curb the corruption, because in a major revision of the allocation of resources in 2006, it has been estimated that up to 40% of the military budget has been used inappropriately, so to speak. So Serdyukov, being the outside man, not part of the structure of Siloviki, he was a very accomplished economist and manager. He imposed his own models of how to control all this corruption, and he recognized that state of Russian army is such that it's very top-heavy, that it has too much formations and accompanying officers, and that too many chiefs, too little number of Indians. So that it needs to be optimized, it needs to be consolidated and made more deployable. Now, in those days, we're talking about late 2000s, early 2010s, there has been no major conventional war on horizon as a potential security risk for Russia. All the conflicts it has been in those days, so we're talking about the Second Chechen War, continuing insurrection in North Caucasus, intervention in Georgia. It could be, in those days, started Syria, so it was probably on the horizon, but it was like a small intervention. All these things were seen as sort of not serious threats, but the threats which still needed some attention. So there has been steady development in a way to emphasize air assault and paratroop units as the most deployable and the best trained. There were attempts to create various variants of the rapid deployable regular troops, attempts to move away from the heavy motor rifle units to lightly motorized units, so they could be utilized perhaps in Central Asia. And all these things were happening in those days, which were perfectly in line with security risks, which were acute, in this era. Now, the problem was that Russian military theory in those days recognized several layers of risk. Well, the first two of them were in different layers of intensity, were those, so to speak, small wars. There was another third one, which was small conventional war with one of its neighbors, and a fourth one, which was a major war against essentially NATO. It hasn't been stated as NATO as by name, but you could read between the lines and recognize NATO, which was essentially recognized that it couldn't be contained in conventional means, and everybody knew it. So because it was the threat of nuclear escalation was seen as such, it has been seen as not really a realistic option. So with the small number of resources allocated, Russia opted to create these smaller, more deployable, more cohesive units, which could be sent to deal with various issues happening, like in Georgia in 2008, like in Syria in 2000s, or, for example, very successfully in January of 2022 in Kazakhstan, where it stopped the attempt of coup. So for this kind of engagements, this was a perfectly organized and set up army. But there were various problems in this development. First of all, there had been a lot of resentment against Serdyukov due to his curbing the number and all these perks that military officer corps had. So there was a backlash against him. Eventually, he was removed in 2002. Shoigu was brought in place. Shoigu kept most of his reforms, and it was impossible to undo them by this point because they were already implemented. But he also was, Shoigu was a man who could deal with various structures. He was more a politician, and this didn't bode well. I think that some of the major issues that Russia experienced today are the results of this kind of unfulfilled reforms, things which were left to hang in the air. And of course, the corruption, because when Shoigu was removed, when Andrei Belousov, who came earlier this year, after 2 months, he did. Now, I don't think that this revision was done only in 2 months. I think it was probably done continually years in advance. And it was just pulled out of the drawer that something like $130 billion is unaccounted. Now, this isn't said for which amount of time this 130 billion was spread, but I suppose that it was during the duration of Shoigu's reign, so to speak. So for about 12 years. And considering that on average, officially at least, the Russian military budget is about $70 billion, it means that, roughly speaking, about 15% of the annual budget each year has been, stolen one way or another. Now, to be perfectly fair, this is not something unique for Russia. Just a few days ago, there has been yet another article, I think it was in Bloomberg or someplace, how U.S. Air Force overpaid 8,000 times some items in their inventory. And I remember when I was a kid back in 1980s, I read exactly same things. How in those days it was a scandal about C-5 Galaxy huge airplanes, which also had almost like a golden-plated toilet desks for in flight and things like that. And over the years, I've been following on about this systemic corruption in U.S. Army, and it was never resolved. I think that in 2018, they actually tried to bring in an outside audit firm, private firm, to audit, Secretary of Defense and its expenditure. And after about 6 months, they resigned. They said, we cannot do this. It's impossible to audit U.S. military. Now, I don't think that most of this money is actually stolen in the United States. I think that most of this money probably gets tucked away in some, black funds, secret projects, secret operations, or is just due to nature of, if you don't spend it, you have to return it back, just tucked away, for operational purposes. But still, if about 10% each year gets unaccounted, you can rest assured that at least 2 or 3% got stolen. And additionally, on top of this, you have systemic, corruption in the United States due to, this revolving door policies that ex-generals you get employed by the military-industrial complex, and that they're always having their future careers once they go to pensions. So all these things are kind of systemic, but they are sort of elegant. On the other hand, the difference is that United States perhaps can allow themselves this kind of corruption, while Russia cannot. And this is the most serious problem, because Russia is fighting for its life. United States isn't. And this is one of those things which actually came to my attention in 2015, because all this reform, which was when Putin took power in late 1999, he was very slow actually to start to rebuild the army. He was more concentrated about trying to pacify situation in Russia, to rebuild social structures, to rebuild economy, and the military was in somewhere down the line of importance. And only after it became clear that this kind of acknowledgement from the West that sort of a soft multipolarity that he pushed in those days is impossible, 2007, 2008, only then it became clear to him that he has to rebuild a structure in the army. So this major rearmament program, which started in those days, after almost 20 years of complete disrepair and lack of provisions, lack of new acquisitions, it started well actually. And between 2008 and 2014-15, it gave very good results. Then when the situation escalated in Ukraine, and the first sanctions were imposed on Russia, and Americans managed to convince the OPEC to lower the price of the oil, this started affecting this rearmament project in Russia. Although my impression is that if you follow the expenditure and what is being bought from hardware, in those days in Russia, my impression is that it didn't affect so much the available funds for the armament, because they were already in place, but that people who were involved in the military-industrial complex of Russia sort of use this as an excuse to start pocketing the money. So there you started seeing that, all those bombastic reports that, we introduced so many, new airplanes, new tanks this year, etc. When go actually see what those new planes and new tanks were, they weren't really new, most of them. There was some small newly produced, but most of them were just refurbished. And I think they were counting that, Putin had a lot of other things to do, and that he is not a military man. So, when they present him with a, new tank, he takes it as a face value, and the difference was pocketed. And this reminds me, there's an anecdote that certain member of the Duma's Security Council in 2009, he was very vocal about advocating that Russia needs new hardware, new technologies, that we need new tanks, like a proper new tanks, not just refurbishing of the old ones. Then when he got promoted, when he got a new job in the Ministry of Defense next year, he completely reversed his narrative and said, no. It's fine. What we have, it's perfectly fine. We don't really have to invest into anything expensive. It's good. So there has been this kind of developments in which various people from Ministry of Defense, from military, from the military-industrial complex, all they had probably their hands in a pie, so to speak. And this affected negatively the material development, at least, of the armed forces. So a lot of the new tech, which was actually existing, it wasn't like Russia was deficient in technologies themselves, but it was deficient in implementing those technologies and producing them on a larger scale. So, for example, in the early 2000s, it was more convenient not to build, for example, new factories to produce microprocessors on various high technology items. It was more convenient to try to buy them on the cheap, off the shelf from international markets, which of course was completely ludicrous, and it came to be paid on the other side once the sanctions started biting in. Then in 2015-16 there was this whole restructuring to attempt to produce everything in-house, which again squandered another few years. To be fair, these attempts to buy things abroad, they were part of the wider strategy to try to bring in various countries, especially European countries, to participate on the Russian market and to tie it politically with it. Especially the France was a major player, and we all know how they ended with those two assault landing ships, which eventually ended up in Egypt. But there were this kind of developments. Also, Ukraine was, because of course, industrial capacity of the military industrial complex of Soviet Union was spread across all of the country, with large focus on Ukraine, because Ukraine was devastated during the Second World War, and after the war there has been a disproportionate level of investments to rebuild Ukraine. So it became much more urbanized than it was before the Second World War. All the brand new cities, brand new apartments, everything was built from grounds up, including the jobs to fill all of this. A lot of factories were built, some very, very strategically important factories. And during the 90s and 2000s, Russia deliberately kept those suppliers from Ukraine as part of its military industrial complex, precisely to tie them in, because they were making good money from selling their products to Russia. And it was mutually beneficial relationship of sorts. Of course, after 2014, this also broke down. And again, most of it, especially the Motor Sich, was strategically very, very important because they produced various engines, especially for the helicopters, for the MIL helicopters. So all these technologies had to be, I won't say redeveloped because they were already known, but rebuilt factories to produce them in Russia, which again have eaten into the resources, eaten into the time, and the later half of the previous decade was spent in trying to fill this void which was created by severing ties with both with Europe and with Ukraine. So it was a setback. Also, there has been sort of a complacency in a lot of corners of the Russian army, in that it's all militaries by nature are conservative. Literally every army in the world is conservative, but Russian army tends to be a little bit more conservative than most other ones, and this expressed itself in both the reluctance to participate in meaningful reforms, and also in when it was implemented, that they didn't really, I think, understand how they were supposed to operate. A lot of officers, at least, not all of them, of course, but a lot of them, and they treated it as something like a transitional, like not something which will be like a permanent. Hence, the improper usage of the structures they were at hand in 2022. So, for example, famous or infamous battalion tactical groups, which has been talked to death in the West. They weren't so much really of issue. I think they were more talked about than actually implemented, but still they were implemented to a certain extent, that they were supposed to participate not as singular formations, but as part of combined arms brigades. But they usually weren't. They were usually part of the ad hoc ersatz formations, which were formed in 2022 from various different elements, depending on which strategic approach we're talking about. But still, they weren't employed properly due to its own doctrinal, intents. So, and there was the sort of a poisoned gift of 2014. Now, in 2014, I mean, we are all old enough here to remember how it all went. Russia had about 6 months to sort of sit back and watch developments in Ukraine up until late July, early August. And the Ukrainian army was in total shambles. I mean, Ukrainian army was several times in worse condition than a Russian army was during the 1990s. It was completely lackluster performance. I mean, it took them 6 months to deal with 10 to 20,000 rebel militias. I mean, this is complete failure. And they had to mobilize essentially entire new army all over again because regular army fell apart. Most of the combat units fighting in summer of 2014 from Ukrainian side were actually not regular army units, but the first incarnation of the National Guard, essentially various volunteer groups which were essentially also militia level formations, because regular army troops just either were deserted or just fell apart or were chewed up in the early months of the combat. I've seen some estimates from the Lost Armor, famous website, Russian website, which actually did meticulous counting of the hardware losses in Ukraine in those days, that about 40% of the hardware possessed by the active, no, we're not talking about all this equipment which was in storage, but active units of the Ukrainian army got destroyed during the first 6 months of the fighting in 2014. I mean, this is huge. These are hundreds and hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, all against, as I said, small number of rebel militias. So when Russian army eventually decided to step in, it was easy going. They were fighting against vastly inferior opponent. They had all the ISR capabilities. They had satellites in place. They had drones, cruising around. So mostly it was, long range contact, not close contact fighting, but long range strikes by the artillery, multi MLRS systems, which obliterated columns and columns of Ukrainian troops. So it was very easy going against such opponent. And I think that many people in Russian army was very self-satisfied with this performance. Losses were negligible, and the disproportional effect, which was conducted upon Ukrainian troops, were just ludicrous. It was a very one-sided affair. And then again, the intervention in Syria was quite successful, again with very small number of losses and on the cheap. So they didn't feel actually the pressure to innovate, and they were you hear it, sir? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Perfectly.
Yes, perfectly.
No, something switched. Okay.
Oh.
So what happened was that they were pretty satisfied with these results. And for example, the Orlan drones. I mean, I will use drones as a sort of a paradigm for various other technologies which were also in place. Orlan drones, which were pretty basic, technologically pretty basic level of drones, which gave very good performance in 2014 in Ukraine. They should have been developed further, but they weren't. It was considered good enough. There were several other development plans for more serious drones, which were so-called MALE, like medium altitude, long endurance drones, like Bayraktar, Turkish, which became famous later on. And in this category, there were several developments. Most promising was the Orion, or Inokodets, it's called in Russia, which was in a relatively long development cycle. And it was actually officially adopted only in 2021. Then in 2022, it was supposed to enter the full-scale production with dozens of units each month, but apparently didn't materialize. So, and there has been a lot of objections to it, that it's needlessly expensive, that it doesn't really fit this kind of warfare which was developed in Ukraine, that it's too vulnerable to air defense units. But if Russia had, say, 500 of those drones, reconnaissance and strike drones, this is very important, they can fulfill both functions, about 500 of them in 2022, they could completely wiped out the remnants of the air defense, which was already in disarray. They could just hunt them down in real time. And it would be a major game changer in those early days. But they weren't there. Now, I don't know. I haven't managed to find any data of how many of them were produced between 2022 and today. It's possible that there is actually a large-scale production somewhere in Russia, but they're not being deployed in Ukraine. Now, last few months, there has been actually considerable usage of them, but only in Kursk, because they are operating from a safe distance, because Ukrainians haven't forward deployed their air defense, and those that were deployed were destroyed. So it's relatively safe for them to operate in this environment. And again, you can see this kind of a imperative to make war on the cheap, not to compromise like more expensive, more high-end assets. Then again, there are certain events which are completely, take this on its own head.
Can I jump in and ask you a question? Because you mentioned 2014, and usually the question that naturally arises is, especially based on your description of the dismal state of the Ukrainian army, did Russia have the capacity to really fully intervene in 2014? As you know, usually the answer is that because of sanctions and fearing the types of sanctions that were implemented from 2022 onward, Russia did not have that economic ability to meet the sanctions. Therefore, it did not intervene militarily. But other people would argue that because the Ukrainian army was in such a poor state, it should have done that earlier on instead of facing more of a NATO-trained army in 2022. What is your take on this?
I mean, I'm not in Putin's shoes, so I cannot comment, upon this geopolitical and economic assessments of the situation. I assume that you are correct, that this was the line of thinking which was probably in place in Kremlin. But from the military standpoint, Russian army in 2014 could march all the way to Kiev, like easy peasy. And on top of that, they would probably be greeted by liberators by huge proportion of Ukrainian society, and there would probably be a large number of officers from Ukrainian army which would be effectively defecting or joining Russia, especially if Russia actually haven't recognized the putschist government and acted as a support in support of the legitimate government which was toppled. So they would have perfect legitimate option to do so, and half of Ukraine would support them. So they would have struggle with extremist elements, with maybe some units of Ukrainian army. But when such things are happening, they're not. You don't have a consolidated front. You don't have like a formal army which is fighting. You only have some here and there pockets of resistance. So it's easy to isolate and annihilate them. So it wouldn't really be a military problem due to all of this. But as you said, probably the reasoning was that Russia economically wasn't prepared for this kind of a confrontation with the West. Now, this is one of those tragedies which periodically happens in Russian history, that due to improper peacetime preparations for certain events, it has to be later repaid with blood. These things come in circles in Russian history. So, because, and I mean, it's not even not even economic. It's more of political failure. Not to. I mean, I'm pretty sure that Russia could have avoided the whole situation in 2014 if it implemented its soft power, which it didn't. It just let things, develop on its own. And I think this is the major problem for Russia, because when I even today, when I speak with many Russians from various walks of life and positions, there's this sense that we have to take care of our own, and everything which is beyond our borders is of no importance. And this is so wrong. I mean, this is abysmal failure to recognize the basic, strategy of defense. The best defense is forward defense, and this is something which late Joseph Stalin understood perfectly. This is the reason why he was so concerned about pushing the borders of Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc as much as westwards as possible, because the westward it is, the longer the amount of territory which is sort of a potential battleground is two heartlands. So you have a rear area. And I think that this is the general resentment probably coming from the 1990s. Although I have to say that there is also kind of a old school Dostoevsky-like understanding of politics in many quarters of Russia, in which we just have to look about our borders, and everything beyond them is none of our concern, which is ludicrous. I mean,
well, I think usually that period, the first decade of the 21st century, is seen in two major ways. Some people like you see the loss of soft power and not really implementing it in any shape or form to a significant extent, especially in Ukraine, as a lost opportunity, which culminated in the tragedy which is ongoing. But the other camp says that because Russia was near collapse itself by the late 90s, then it was embroiled in the Second Chechen War, right, coming out of the First Chechen War in the 90s. It did not have the capacity to intervene either in the former Yugoslavia in 1999 and actually have any meaningful impact, or in Ukraine in terms of implementing soft power. In my opinion, the truth is somewhere in between. I think more things could have been done as far as Ukraine, because obviously it's not just a random country where you promote yourself as a natural ally or a friend, or however you want to qualify it. It's a country with shared history, shared language, shared families that live across the border. So it's much more than that. So it would have been much easier to implement soft power there in opposition to these Western NGOs that obviously permeated Ukraine and the former Soviet Union since the moment that the Soviet Union dissolved. So that's definitely one question. I have a lot of questions based on what you've introduced so far. So let me try to do two. In what way did the more limited actual physical fighting in the conflicts that you've described in Chechnya, the Northern Caucasus, Georgia, maybe a little bit in Syria, in what way did it shape the thinking of some more significant people in the Russian army? So for instance, when General Armageddon, as he is known in the West, came into power briefly, people talked about his experience in Chechnya, they talked about his experience later on. In what way did that actually physically shape his thinking in terms of fighting? And my second question, and please let me know whether I should repeat it once you address the first one, is you talked about the general differences in the managerial style of the Russian army in the post-Soviet period. So you talked about Shoigu being more of a politician. You talked about having more of sort of like an economic manager coming in. In your opinion, what is the best way to manage the Russian army to the best of its ability, its capacity? Should it be a military man? Should it be more of an economic man who is a manager? Should it be a politician? I mean, you kind of made the case that maybe not, but I'm curious what you think about these two.
Okay, the first question is that, well, as I said, Russia in its new doctrine, which was formed under Gerasimov, and a lot of it has been talked about, so-called Gerasimov's doctrine, which in the West, which is not what it really is. Now, I cannot go too much into it because it would take way too long. But as I said, security concerns, and there are those are serious documents. You have serious studies which are conducted to identify all the threats to the major countries. They recognize that most likely cause of the problems is going to be this subnational level of conflicts. Terrorists, perhaps some of the smaller countries, maybe some peacekeeping interventions like in Central Asia, that these are the type of conflicts which caused the most problem for Russia in those days, about 10, 15 years ago, which was the case. I mean, it was factually true. One thing they didn't count on is precisely the scenario which happened in 2022, and that is a large-scale conventional war with near-peer opponent. Because in case of conflict with NATO, personally, I don't see how it would go conventional for more than a few weeks. I mean, I cannot imagine a scenario in which it stays contained conventional. And I think there was a recognition of this in Russian general staff. So they didn't really count on this kind of conflict because nobody in their right mind would risk global nuclear war, but they were mostly concerned about this lower level of conflicts, which could be used to destabilize Russia, as Chechnya was during the 1990s, or to help some allies like in Syria. So the whole army was geared towards this kind of a conflict. Of course, it had potential, which is realized right now during this war, to expand. The military service, mandatory military service, although it's debatable how mandatory it is, because as far as I know, in Russia, practically whomever doesn't want to serve the army doesn't serve it. So maybe only 10% of the young men who are of age, 10 to 15% of age to do the national service actually do it. Everybody else, get deferments for various minor health issues, or they study, or something like that. Essentially, only those who really want to serve, they serve. So there's that. But still, this kind of a very limited service, or about 200,000 people a year, is enough to create some sort of a reserves. Again, there has been a lot of pushback, a lot of animosity from the Russian military towards any kind of irregular or semi-regular formations. They like to keep it all, tidy and top down in control. So, for example, the active reserve project called BARS, which actually gave a very, very, very good account in the fighting in Ukraine. Those are the guys who served the army. A lot of them are veterans from previous wars. And they're willing to, it's essentially like the National Guard in America. They're willing to do the part-time training and retraining, not to be full-time for service members, but still. This has been dragged on for years, and there was an obvious, bureaucratic pushback against this project. And it was dragged on between 2018, 19, 20. Eventually, again, in 2021, it was formally implemented, but only in a southern military district and to the limited number of battalions. No, the thing is that those men are usually elderly, middle-aged men. All of them have previous military experience. A lot of them are, as I said, military veterans. All of them are patriots. All of them are willing, and they gave a very, very good account of themselves in this war. So, not expanding on this project and not expanding upon it earlier is such a wasted opportunity that's incredible. Also, these various self-imposed limitations of the usage of armed forces, like not using young recruits in combat operations. I mean, I can understand from a political standpoint, because it doesn't look good, when recruits get, killed and sent back home in metal caskets. But still, they are fighting for their country. And I mean, they're not fighting in Afghanistan, for example, or in Syria. I mean, I can understand that kind of limitations. But this is Russian national territory, and not just Kursk, but also Zaporozhye and, Kherson. So, it's very, very limiting. I mean, and the scale of the Russian army at the beginning of all this was historically at a low point. I'm talking about conventional ground troops, not about air force and strategic forces and all this, and a huge number of people who were in a background. United Logistics Services, various military educational institutions, all this. I mean, this is huge number of people, but ground component was practically the size of the Ukrainian army. And it was significantly smaller than, for example, a Russian army of 1812 was. Where when Russia had, I don't know how many times a lesser population than it has today. So this is kind of illustration of this line of thinking that major conventional war is simply impossible, because whom would they wage against? What they failed to, I think that they underestimated the development of the Ukrainian army. I mean, Ukrainian army was, as I said, in total mess in 2014-15, but gradually it started consolidating itself and started developing. I'm not really sure how much NATO training is important in all of this, because NATO training has its many drawbacks and limitations, but still they had their own combat experience. and they continuously rotated troops, regular army and national battalions in a line of contact in a supposedly peacetime line of contact in Donbass. But a huge number of people in Ukrainian army and Ukrainian society actually felt the smell of gunpowder. And this is very important because this kind of experience, even if it's not high intensity combat, even if you're just sitting in trenches and you occasionally you had some sniper duels or mortars being exchanged, it still sort of hardens men, and you get some experience of some sort of warfare. And this, I think, it was the major benchmark of Ukrainian army in 2022, because they had a huge number of men who were familiar, at least. Maybe they were not, like proper veterans of a large war, but they were familiar with war, and they were hyped up. Hyped up because they had NATO behind them. They had all this new fancy weapon coming in, and this is something which I don't know. I was thinking about the very early days of the war. That for me, the most logical thing. I mean, I fully expected that Western support would come to WSO. I actually expected that. I mean, if I was a general, which I'm not, although I'm sitting in a comfortable chair, that the most logical thing would be actually to try to cut off these supplies coming in, and probably advance to Vinnytsia, and cutting off the Western Ukraine from Eastern and Central Ukraine would strategically make most sense, instead of advancing through Chernigov and Sumy and all these directions which are really of no importance. Once singular largest thrust, cutting off physically, preventing these reinforcements would be much more better thought through. But obviously there were different logics in place, and I mean, it was a gamble, and this gamble almost succeeded. And if this gamble succeeded, there wouldn't be this major war. Everything would be done, resolved sort of elegantly, without too many casualties from both sides. But it failed, and now we have what we have, which is complete grind with tremendous number of casualties. So I don't know. I mean, I sense that there was this kind of underestimation of the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian society in total, because I think this comes from this kind of isolation on the Russian people, mostly political leadership, that they fail to understand the processes which were taking place. I mean, I have seen this in Yugoslavia, so I fully understand what was happening in Ukraine in this time period. You can actually hype up people for war. If you want to do it, you can do it. You can prep them, and you can prep them for taking a large number of casualties to endure. For example, at the very early days of the war, I actually conducted sort of I mean, these things are very difficult to assess, but I expected that, and I still, I mean, I'm standing by this. I think that this war will end as sort of like the First World War ended, with military mutinies and with complete, breakdown of the front lines and internal society behind. Now, taking into account events from 1918 in Germany, in Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in Bulgaria. And Bulgaria is perhaps even the most, the best example out of this. Extrapolated to the amount of people which I estimated in Ukraine, I expected sort of about 500,000 casualties, killed casualties, not wounded, killed Ukrainian soldiers. That would be more or less a breaking point. Now, this isn't exact science, and it might be 400 or 600 or 700,000, but somewhere in this range. Now, I don't know how many people are actually being killed until now. I expect somewhere north of 400,000. So we are entering this zone of potential breakdown, but there is a different drawbacks in place, because first of all, what Clausewitz called center of gravity, which every country in war have, it's actually not in Ukraine, it's in the West. So if it was in Ukraine, this war wouldn't last a month, because their internal capacity to wage war, from standpoint of logistics, standpoint of all the resources which are needed to wage war, are simply non-existent. All of this comes from the West. So it's and Russia, of course, cannot target this center of gravity in the West, because that would mean Third World War. So it has to sort of allow all these things to come to filter through, and it's not even so much about hardware, although it's most visible thing, it's most talked about. It's mostly about money, and not just money for the salaries of regular army troops in Ukraine, but also salaries of whole society. Everybody gets funded to this, and this influx of money actually gives boost to national morale. Now, for example, in the First World War, Germany was under tremendous sanctions and the military blockade from United Kingdom, also the France, and later on the United States. So it suffered something like 700,000 or 800,000 people who starved to death due to this naval blockade. And there were even cases of frontline troops starving, which was incredible from today's point of view. But it did happen. So, for example, there was this one of the promises which Hitler made in 1930s, that in the next war, no German soldier will starve to death. So of course Ukrainians are not starving, because even if they're not producing their own food, it's coming from abroad. But everything else comes from abroad, and it's very difficult to stop all of it. So essentially, the only way to completely break down their warfighting capacity is through actual physical elimination of hardware, and not just in Ukraine, in the hardware from the whole West, potential hardware which could be sent, and also physical elimination of physical bodies. Now there is a different calculus in all this, because people in the First World War in said countries couldn't leave. So if you had naval personnel in Kiel, when presented with process of being conscripted and sent to fill the ranks of the frontline troops in the Western Front, they had no other choice but to mutiny. And this was one of the major reasons, which led to the collapse of the government, German government, in 1918. On the other hand, in Ukraine, a lot of people, fled a long time ago, and they're still fleeing. And they could, try to hide individually or desert individually. So all this pressure, which could have been in place if the borders were closed, is absent. I've seen different numbers, but probably 11 to 12 million Ukrainians left Ukraine. I mean, this is huge. Now, granted, most of those people were women, but still 3 to 4 million men of all ages. I mean, I've seen several Ukrainian estimates. They're talking usually about 8 to 900,000 able-bodied men in abroad, which could be conscripted and should be. I mean, this is one entire Ukrainian army, which is actually sitting abroad. And those men, if they were in Ukraine and if they were being conscripted, they could mutiny. They could form the nucleus of the resistance, because, obviously, because they are abroad, they do not wish to fight and to be killed. But because they're absent, there is a lack of this nuclei of resistance to the war. There is, occasionally you can see some spontaneous attacks on recruiting, bands and things like that. But these are small scale. I mean, this is not something which could be, affect the entire society. So this means that those people who are, captured in Ukraine, who couldn't leave, who didn't have money to bribe the, guards, or simply didn't leave when it was possible to do so, essentially they are fucked. They are here to die, and they will, die until the end. And there are more and more talks about lowering the age of conscription in Ukraine. Some of them even mentioning 16 years old, and obligatory service for all women, not just some categories of them. So I mean, it's the whole adage of West will fight to the last Ukraine is like literally true. And it's not a metaphor; it's like a very literal thing. And
if I may just got here a second. Just today, I was watching, before we come live, I was watching to Alex Christoforou, and one of the news that he was breaking was exactly that: the pressure for the Ukrainian government to put the women to do the backstage military work, logistics and all that, so the men can go and die. And numbers that you mentioned there, 11 million, okay, not all of them are men, but talking about a country that recently has posted like a census that there are like 19 million Ukrainian now living in Ukraine. That's a second Ukraine almost. That's a second Ukraine outside Ukraine. And I totally agree with what you said, that there's sparkles of mutiny. Perhaps a week or two ago, I saw some social unrest in Odessa and some very particular areas, but the rest of the country, it kind of looks for me from outside that is completely unaware of what is going on. And it goes back to the soft power. I had a neighbor that was Ukrainian, a lady, and it was amazing how from night to day, and she's living in Italy, from night to day, she completely forgot everything that she had taught me about Ukraine before 2022 special military operation, which kind of corroborates with everything that the media says it's a lie. She was telling me as a true before the becomes a lie. In 1 minute, she was from a Russian-speaking area, and she then starts saying that she didn't speak any Russian. And she believed, that on the what's it called, the voting for the regions to be integrated to Russia, people were going to vote, with the gun in the back and all that. And I was like, dude, you were telling me otherwise like 6 months ago. What happened? And that's because basically she listens to Ukrainian media here.
Well, I think it's a little bit propaganda, but I think people who are immigrants or refugees, they may not necessarily share their true opinions with the dominant majority population. And I've seen this. And I've seen this with other immigrant communities, not just the Russian-speaking communities. Once you sort of allow them that it's okay to share such and such opinions, they really change. So I would take that with a grain of salt. It could be part influence of the propaganda machine, but
you are right if it was someone that I didn't know. And by the way, she is married to a Moldavian guy who completely shared the same perspectives that we do here. And so inside her house, there was a completely split of opinions that most likely they didn't care inside because they are living here. But the interesting was exactly that. It was a person that I knew and I know, and I knew the opinions before everything, and then after everything, it completely changed. So we had this openly talk. That particular case was not the case of someone that I will not share with you because I don't know what you're going to think about me. But yeah, you're right about that as well. I'm sorry, just wanted to jump into to mention this facts.
But listening, go ahead.
There's probably some other psychological developments happening, especially among immigrants. Most rabid, Ukrainian, most combative nationalists you can meet online are all abroad. And, the natural question is, okay, if you feel that way, why don't you go and fight, for your country? But I think that there's probably a lot of compensation, a lot of the enjoying the social capital they have been, awarded in the West, so that they feel that they need to sort of earn it by reproducing it. all these things are happening. I mean, and as Nina said, it's not unique for Ukrainians. It happened in other immigrant communities.
But I'd like to go back to your description of this kind of unusual circumstances of possibly the collapse of the Ukrainian army, where in some ways it's replicating previous wars, in other ways it's very different because of this ability to immigrate, for instance. Going back to the Russian perspective, you talked about the obviously inability of Russia to fight a direct war with NATO countries because of the fear of a nuclear exchange. Why has Russia been restrained up until recently in terms of targeting supplies and some of these facilities, railroads? Yes, there has been an escalation. I mean, the media has sort of circulated recently this agreement between Russia and Ukraine where they're not going to strike each other's like oil refineries, let's say in Russia, and then Ukraine still did it, and then Russia considered that agreement broken. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but why has Russia been restrained? I understand the idea of being restrained in terms of losing men, and then eventually you sort of have to use men. But what about striking this Western equipment where it really hurts? Why has that been an issue?
I don't think it has been an issue. I think that whenever they found a major location which was in place, they hit it. I don't know if you, for example, remember that was I think it was in May last year, when there has been this small spike of radioactivity. Apparently, I mean, I'm pretty sure it's actually correct that they hit a warehouse which housed these nuclear depleted tank shells, and this was a major thing. I mean, this was like a really serious thing. So I think that they don't bother too much with small bits and pieces of equipment, but when something major is being shipped, they tracked it and they kill it. There are some other things in which Russians are very, very, how to put it, very cautious of not provoking the escalation. And for example, in the Black Sea, I mean, Russia legally, I mean, they could have declared that the entire international airspace in the Sea is closed. This has been done. It's legally to do in case of armed conflict. Countries can do it legally, and nobody can actually stop them under international law. But they choose not to, which opened up the possibility of NATO drones and reconnaissance aircraft not just doing reconnaissance missions, but actually targeting, guiding the targeting of naval drones and ballistic missiles on all of this, which is qualitatively completely new thing, because during the previous wars in which you had neutral sides, like, I don't know, Spanish Civil War, you had, for example, a French government which was sympathetic to Republicans, and it maybe provided them some information, etc. But providing some information is one thing. Actually providing, targeting data link in real time is actually participating in armed conflict. And Russians should, I mean, in my personal opinion, they should have shot down the whole bunch of the drones. Everything which flew inside international airspace, which neared up until, I don't know, 150 kilometers to Crimea, should have been shot down. And this is like a over cautiousness, which sort of colors this entire conflict from the Russian side. I will mention in 1952, there was this, in those days, famous incident with Swedes, so-called Catalina incident. Now, what happened was that Sweden, which was supposedly a neutral country, ran its military airplanes in international airspace of Baltics, but those airplanes were filled with British and American latest electronic reconnaissance and signal intelligence gathering equipment, which apparently nobody in Sweden but some people in the military knew about. So it wasn't condoned by the Swedish government. It was, in effect, a project from the Swedish deep state. And those Swedish airplanes patrolled the airspace nearby Soviet Union and collected data. Apparently, Soviet Union intelligence knew about all of this, and they shot down two of those planes. One was Dakota, another one's Catalina, and Catalina was a hydroplane, and the incident became known about this particular airplane. And for decades, it was like a completely, shut down the whole story. In the end, only 1990s, Swedes admitted that, those planes were actually spying on behalf of the Americans and the British. So, you had Swedish military personnel from the neutral country getting killed because of it. But the difference is that in 1952, Soviet Union was willing to escalate and shot down planes doing this kind of shit in international airspace, even without armed conflict. While Russia has suffered its casualties, both in military personnel and in military equipment, by allowing these things to proceed. So, I cannot, as I said, I'm not in a driver position in Kremlin, so I don't know what all the variables they have to calculate and what is acceptable loss in relation to maybe something else. From the Western side, when we talk about the West, we talk about it as it's monolithic, and it really isn't. There are various interest groups which were competing with each other with different ideas and different agendas, and I think that on average, all these pushes and pulls, on average, the West is playing the game of blackjack. They had to reach the line of escalation, but not to cross it. At least from the American standpoint. I don't know really what Europeans think, because Europeans are completely out there in the left field. But from American perspective, they need to push Russians to the brink, but they don't want to of course escalate over that, because it would be nuclear warfare. And Russians are probably playing this game. I'm pretty sure that there is a backdoor diplomacy between Russian military and the Pentagon, or at least maybe Defense Intelligence Agency. I sort of suspect it's about them, so that they are sort of working to not to de-escalate, but to prevent from over-escalating. And it's a dance, and I'm pretty sure that those people in America are under tremendous pressure from their own, especially from neocons, to go forward and to escalate further on. So they had to deal both with Russians and with their own neocons. And we can only imagine how it actually looks like. My suspicion is that part of it is reflected on the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive last year, because apparently NATO ran some 20 different war games in which they conducted how it is supposed to proceed. Now, those war games were obviously complete abysmal failure, because we know how it ended. I could have told them how it will end, and I'm not really managing the data that they are, which means that their data was faulty. Now, if NATO commands in Mons and in Rammstein were dealing with faulty data and acting upon it, who provided this data? Was it Ukrainians or was it Americans? And if Americans provided them, did they knowingly provide faulty data to achieve this effect, or they simply didn't have proper data?
That's a terrifying thought. That's terrifying. We don't have bunkers here, but my question is the extent to which...
Just a second. There is a third variable there, that perhaps the rule of the game, of the simulation, is not as good as it should.
I don't know the exact methodology of how those games were conducted, but essentially those things are mathematical matrices. And if you enter the faulty premises, you will get faulty results. If you enter good premises, you will probably get decent results. And it's a game. Those things are getting repeated numerous times, and you get the sort of average results, so to speak. So they must have been fed simply a faulty input of data to work with. I could have told them that, obviously. Everybody who was following the whole situation could have told them that. But I think that there's on one level there was a groupthink. There was there's I suspect, strong ideological pressure on everybody involved that this is how it is, and even if you suspect it isn't, will you risk your career?
We call it buying your own bullshit, basically.
Yeah.
But to go back to these new technologies, to what extent do they impact the actual warfare? Because on the one hand, we're seeing reports that, they're using World War I style trenches that they've dug themselves into since 2014. On the other hand, we're looking at all this drone warfare that you touched upon several times in this conversation. What impact is it actually having, the newer technologies, on the progress of the war?
They have pretty large extent. 2022 and 23. This year, not so much. Apparently it sank in, and everybody sort of understand that there indeed is a revolution of sorts in warfare. And it's not just the drones. Drones are most visible aspect of it, but it's not just the drones. It's the whole computing, thing, the way, how fast you can process the information, that how fast can you direct artillery fire, for example. Also the space assets which are being used from both sides. Now, Ukrainians allegedly buy data from the open market. Yeah. Of course, we know that it's not really true. And Russia entered Russia essentially because satellite technologies are expensive, and Russians didn't really like to spend a lot of money about on such technologies. They sort of kept some of its satellites in orbit, reconnaissance satellites, but not many of them. And definitely they weren't enough in 2022 to achieve what was needed. So in 2023, they launched a whole lot of new satellites, and it's a good thing that they managed to produce them in short amount of time. And right now, the situation is significantly better for Russians. But still, there is a parity. Well, maybe not even. Maybe it's even still on the Western/Ukrainian side, because we don't know how many satellite photos and information and in which time frame they get delegated from Americans. I suppose that Americans are not sharing with them everything they have. They're probably selective about which data are being shared with Ukrainians in real time. But still, it's a huge. Nobody can match American assets from the space reconnaissance. Russians are 2 levels below in sheer quantity of it. On the other hand, Americans have to disperse all these assets to cover everything, the entire globe, while Russians can concentrate them on what is important for them. So maybe there is sort of a parity. We can only guesstimate. But for example, one of these technologies which were already in place but haven't been funded, that haven't been implemented in Russia, has been broadband space-based internet. Which did exist as a technology, and it's in development right now. It's probably going to be operational by 2027. But still, it's a few years too late.
Kind of Starlink stuff.
Yeah, equivalent of Starlink. Yeah, but so right now Russians are using Starlink in Ukraine, and apparently all the Americans try to very concerned efforts to prevent this. I think it's not really possible because unless each and every station of Starlink has its own special code installed, which I think it has, on a line of contact, it's very difficult to assess. Do they in X SpaceX know where the exact line of contact is? A few kilometers left or a few kilometers on the right. Obviously they don't. So they can either just blanket shut everybody, or they have to allow in this narrow area. They can shut down probably 50 kilometers away from the front line, but not on the front line itself. And Ukrainians recently claimed that they have shot down Geran drone equipped with Starlink itself, which is ingenious because since it enters a Ukrainian airspace, it operates under the protection of the Starlink. So it's invisible, because it registers as Ukrainian asset. So, but all these things, as ingenious as they are short-term solutions. Russia really, really need this kind of a technology right now, and probably it's going to be implemented by the time this war ends, maybe for the next war. Who knows?
So I have two questions to wrap up this discussion. This was very fascinating to me because I'm not a technology person. The first question is, to what extent do you think Russia was successful changing over its industries to more of a wartime industry structure and production? And the second question would be, I know people don't like making predictions. Maybe you do. Is it possible to make a prediction as to where this war would end? You sort of alluded to a World War I type scenario, but if you can sort of expand on that a little bit, that would be very helpful for our listeners and viewers.
I don't like making predictions, but for my own purposes, I have to, because all of us have need for some kind of internal epistemology, of sorts. So there's that. The first question is that I think that Russians have done a very, very good job. I think that this war really galvanized the entire, both industry and society at large in Russia, and it gave it a sense of purpose, and it really shook up. Both in the military and the military-industrial complex, a lot of bad apples have been identified and removed. And this happens in all armies. Every peacetime army, by its nature, tends to cultivate people who are, parquet generals, and people who are, it's very, only through baptism of fire you can actually see who is, competent and courageous and who isn't. And to the extent it also expands upon whole society. Only under stress you can actually, stress test society at large. And I think the Russians have done very, very good, actually. Now, it's not over yet, so, it's premature to draw total conclusions. But up until now, they have done a very good job in both in militarization of its industry. And although I would have to say that contrary to the Western writings, which claim, total mobilization, full production, it's not really the case. I mean, yes, factories, military factories, and factories which are connected to the military industrial complex, they do work in free shifts, but there are other capacities which haven't been opened. There are capacities which are untapped and which are served for total escalation in a case like a proper Third World War, and those assets are still untouched. So let's say that Russia can, by most realistic estimates, produce 400 to 500 newly built tanks, not refurbished, but newly built a year. I'm pretty sure that in case of the prolonged major escalation, they could double it. But that would require additional resources which are not really needed right now. This is another level of strategic escalation. So there's that. And they're catching up with all of these new technologies. These things take time, and these things to refine and to see what works and what doesn't. And this has been a very good testing ground for the West too. For example, this summer there has been the first successful, allegedly, first successful use of drones which were reinforced against electronic warfare. American drones which were used in Ukraine. So this is probably one of the vectors of development which will further on develop. And of course, every measure has its countermeasure, and it goes in cycles. That means that Russian electronic warfare will have to be staged up to follow this. And the thing is that these development cycles are crazy right now, because in wartime time is condensed, and development cycles are happening much faster than in a peacetime. So when you can really see it, Americans sort of can follow it to the point, but Europeans absolutely cannot. European cycles of technological developments are so slow and so complex and so expensive that they are falling way behind. I mean, they will not be prepared to fight a war in the next 10 years. I'm pretty sure about it. So, and by this point, technologies possessed by the Russians, Chinese, and Americans will be way, way out there. So everything is condensed, and the cycles of development are shorter. And there's a dichotomy that, on one hand, when you're in a war, you need a lot of workable weapons right now, as many of them as possible. On the other hand, those are usually small-scale developments, which are not revolutionary. They're evolutionary. And serious revolutionary arms take time to produce. So a lot of this high-end stuff, which is being developed in Russia, hasn't still been used, at least in serious numbers, in Ukraine. Maybe they have been like a small tested, like Sukhoi 57, for example, which has been confirmed to be tested inside battle space, but not on a regular basis, only to see how it behaves. So I think that Russians are actually, while fighting this war, they are preparing army for another war. And I think that a lot of the troops which are known to be in existence are actually never deployed inside Ukraine on front lines, or inside new borders of Russia and whatever. But they're kept in reserves just in case. They're periodically being rotated, some units, to the front lines to get some experience, combat experience. But I think that at least 1/3 of the combat-ready units of the Russian army are actually being kept in strategic reserve, and they are being gradually enlarged. And Russians are, I think, seriously preparing for the possible confrontation with NATO. And all these high-end toys, which are just being tested in Ukraine, are actually being prepared for potentiality of such war in the future. Maybe not right now, maybe in 2, 3, 5, 10 years, but we're talking about this time frame. And this sort of segues into your second question, is that I think that Ukraine doesn't have capacity to fight indefinitely. I mean, as I said, I estimate initially 500,000 as a sort of a trash line they could sustain. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less. I don't know. There is definite the finite amount of manpower which is there, and there is also a finite amount of hardware which could be provided by the West. Most of the Europe has been pretty much drained. I mean, they're really scrubbing the bottom of the barrel to find anything to send. Americans do have relatively large stockpiles of the reserve equipment, although not necessarily the equipment which is needed for this kind of warfare. They can send thousands and thousands of mine resistance armored vehicles, but this is not really like the equipment which is needed. I mean, it's better than nothing. It's certainly better to drive in this than in a civilian pickup, but this is not a war-winning weapon, definitely. I mean, they can send some more Bradleys, they can send a lot this or that, but without seriously biting into the strategic stockpiles of the United States, it's always going to be limited amounts. And I don't think that U.S. Army will allow to seriously degrade its own potential warfighting capabilities, because they are geared toward fighting China in a near future, and they have to be prepared to rise up for this occasion. I think there are hard caps of what they can send to Ukraine. And you can see it, when Zelensky is bitching about they promised us this, they promised us that, and they're not delivering. Yeah, there's a good reason for that. And the latest tantrum he had is about the Tomahawk missiles.
No, Tomahawks.
Yeah. I mean, completely leaving aside strategic implications, they claim that if they launch 1,000 cruise missiles, they could take out major industrial production centers in Russia. Technically, according to current Russian nuclear posture, this could be a cause for nuclear retaliation. It's in writing. Literally, this kind of scenario would cause nuclear reciprocity, and probably not just against Ukraine. So it's out of the picture. Then again, even from a strictly logistical position, there is no possibility to launch 1,000 these Tomahawk missiles, even if they were being provided, because back in 1980s, Americans actually had deployed in Europe it's kind of a truck-based mobile launchers with Tomahawks, which was of serious concern for the Soviet Union in those days, together with Pershing missiles. But they have been under the START 2 agreement. They have been dismantled and destroyed. So right now, Americans, when they dropped out on their own initiative from the agreement, they started rebuilding similar launchers. They're called Typhoons right now. They're actually containers which are multi-purpose. They can launch several different types of missile, including the cruise missiles. But due to current table of organization, only 4 batteries of such systems are being envisioned. I think that only 2 are operational right now, but 4 of them are being planned. And this means 4 batteries, each of 4 vehicles, and 4 vehicles with 4 launchers. So one battery has 16 tubes to be launched. And 16 cruise missiles are nothing. I mean, even if they got one of those 4 batteries, 16 cruise missiles, most of them would be shot down in a process. Maybe few of them would be, pass through and hit something. But then those launchers would be absolutely prime target for retaliatory strikes. So, like, even from the strictly, like a material standpoint, this is a completely nonsensical idea. I mean, if you wanted to do something, you would have to launch simultaneously 1,000 missiles, which I don't think even Americans could do, unless they launched all the strategic bombers and everything was launched from the air at the same time. But this is the end of the world scenario. It's not realistic. So all of this nonsense.
Is there sort of a timeline? Do you think it's going to be over, quote unquote, in a year, in 6 months? And what would the new borders would be, if we could sort of wrap it up and summarize? I know it's difficult to make predictions, but
I cannot say when, because probably I don't think that Ukrainians could sustain this level of losses and this dynamic of being pushed back. Maybe year and a half, 2 years. I mean, this is the sort of a timeline which is maximum, I think, that we can realistically talk about. And I don't know, maybe they will. There has been a talk right now, which is ironically something which was being proposed back in 2022 by the Ukrainian military, to retreat to the other side of the Dnieper River and try to form the line of defense over there. Now, this could help, but then again, they cannot realistically retreat all the way because they would lose, cities like Dnipropetrovsk, which is very, very important for various reasons. They could still be targeted by long-range missile fires from the Russian side. The retreat would be very chaotic because, unlike Russians who managed to retreat several times in a perfectly good order, retreat from the Kherson, Western Kherson area and city of Kherson was absolutely brilliantly conducted. It was a retreat, but they haven't lost, I think, a single vehicle or soldier. This is one of the toughest things you can do in a military operation, is to disengage from combat and retreat in good order. And they managed to do so. Similar thing was only slightly less effective near 2022. No, Izium was actually a different kind of operation. I'm talking about Kiev, retreat to Belarusia. And there have been some stragglers which have been eliminated in the process, but still very light casualties in the whole process. So Russians can do this, but I'm not really sure that Ukrainians could do this. They don't have the motorization and have organization to do so, and they would probably suffer very, very heavy casualties in the process if they attempt to do so. Anyhow, I don't think this is going to be over for at least another year and a half. And I think that simply put, Ukrainian military and Ukrainian society have to be drained dry. There is this old wisdom that wars last as long as they can. And I think this is going to be the case in Ukraine. And I think that similarly to the way how the Axis powers sort of spontaneously, more or less, disintegrated in 1918. You had military rebellions in Bulgarian army. You had mass desertions in Hungarian army. You had this massively politically important rebellion of the German sailors who refused to be sent to the front lines, which influenced the German government to seek peace. I think this is something similar which is going to happen in the end. And of course, there's going to be a gradual war weariness being built up inside Ukrainian society. I think it's already being felt right now. It's sort of kept under control due to, on one hand, propaganda, on the other hand, the sheer repressive measures from the military and various paramilitary formations. But for another year or two, we'll see. I think this is the maximum of how long the Ukrainian society as a whole could function. Of course, you will have some remnants, you will have some disgruntled veterans, you will have some Nazi battalions here and there, but they will continue fighting on their own, but this won't be organized like a massive resistance.
Almost sounds like Banderites in the post-1945 into the 1950s. Well, this just means that we're going to have to keep inviting them back to see whether your prediction is keep you sort of, I guess, on track to see whether your prediction is coming to fruition or not. This is the logical consequence of tying you down to a particular timeline. Marcelo, I think it's getting late on your end in Europe. So do you have any parting words before we thank Andrej for his being a wealth of information today?
Well, unusually, there was not many comments today on the chat, but there
were
a
people
lot of
in
people
the chat that were listening. Yeah, it basically was like a lecture. Yeah, usually we have lots of people chiming in, but we had just as many people tuned in, but not talking as much. So you were obviously
not talking as much today. But yeah, no, I promise I still have like 2,000 questions, but that we'll have to call for another opportunity. But otherwise, we're going to just start a whole new discussion that would take hours to get to an end. And I mean, people in my next door wants to sleep as well. But yeah, no, it was amazing. One thing that I would like to comment, and perhaps we leave a door open for another conversation, is that I see what I see from the beginning of the special military operation, the way that Russia has been conducting the war. It always reminded me of, as a Brazilian, it's not very much talked about as the Paraguayan War between Brazil and Paraguay. Well, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay against Paraguay. And it's considered one of the first total wars in modern times. And what I see on that, it really looks to me as a total war, but not Russia against Ukraine. As you said, the central gravitational point of the war is not in Ukraine. So I think we are heading in perhaps not a nuclear exchange, hopefully. I'm trying to hope, exercising hope here. But I think the plan, when they decided to do this, is that we cannot stop in Berlin this time. And I'm not talking about, simply aggression against Europe, military aggression against Europe. It's just metaphorically, we cannot stop in Berlin this time. We need the enemy to not have possibility to inflict more chaos and more damage to our society. I don't know. Perhaps it's just a change of paradigms. Perhaps I'm completely wrong.
Well, one of my takeaways from this is Russia's overly excessive cautiousness is not paying off. So this is something that needs to be reconsidered. And we're obviously not in the government's main chair, as Andrej pointed out, because we don't know all the multiple variables that are involved in making these decisions. But from where we sit, that seems to be one of the major takeaways. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. I know it's the US election day, and I think it's nice to take a break from that coverage and focus on something that's kind of different for our channel, but something that we would love to do again and focus on more specific analysis, perhaps with you, Andrej, next time. So you're welcome to come back. Again, thank you for being a wealth of information. Do you have any parting words? I know you're not super active on social media, but if people can find you on a public social media, this would be the time to plug it.
No, they cannot.
They cannot. I'm going to continue stealing memes from an anonymous account and getting credit for something that I did not find, which is, I guess, how social media works. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you for coming, Andrej. This was amazing. And I think we'll wrap it up here, and we'll see you next time.
Well, remember to like, share, subscribe, everybody. Please, Andrej, you have some final words?
No, I just have to say that it's been a pleasure talking to you, and hope to see you next time.
Definitely.
It was our pleasure as well. Thank you very much, sir, and thank you, everybody, and see you guys next time. Bye-bye.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.